Welcome to The Fully Mindful, where we explore what it means to live with intention, creativity, authenticity, and connection. I'm your host, Melissa Chareau, mindfulness and breathwork facilitator, neurodivergent lawyer and coach, and fellow human navigating this wild and beautiful ride we call life. On this podcast, we dive deep with interviews featuring inspiring guests, share solo mini episodes packed with guided mindfulness practices to help you center and thrive, and mix things up with tangents and sidebars, where my friend and fellow podcaster Debbie Harrell from the New World Normal joins me for some real, random, and meaningful conversations. So if you're ready to pause, reflect, and expand, you're in the right place. Let's get fully mindful.
I just believe that I have a passion for mental health, and I believe that's my purpose. I believe I'm living a purposeful life, and I feel satisfied. I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be, and everything that I've been through has brought me here. And it might not have been easy going through it. I didn't see it then, but I can see it now. Everything. It makes sense now. At this time in my life, I think an important part of it is that we take our experiences and we make it meaningful. So that has to do with the reframing. So that rather than just feeling that life is just happening to us, that we go, okay, how can I take this and make it meaningful and purposeful?
Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live with mental illness? Or perhaps, if you have lived experience with mental illness, what it would be like to offer hope to others just like you? Our next guest, Kitt O'Malley, is author of Balancing Act, Writing Through a Bipolar Life, in which she offers hope to those living with mental illness and their loved ones. She's a former therapist who left her career due to mental illness, and she's now a powerful advocate for mental health and tirelessly fights the stigma against those living with mental illness. She is both down to earth, wildly smart, and disarmingly honest about her own challenges. And by doing so, she unmasks stigma for what it is and lets listeners see what it really is like to have overcome her struggles with bipolar disorder and to become a mental health advocate, mother, wife, and daughter. You'll want to hear this interview, and you'll see it's an intimate, candid story that will surely offer insight into living with mental illness and hope for those who do. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Well, here we are. This is Melissa with The Fully Mindful, and I'm here with Kitt O'Malley, who is a wonderful author, as well as a former therapist and a very strong mental health advocate now, and has her own lived experience, which I hope we can get into a little bit today. So thank you, Kitt, for being here today on The Fully Mindful.
Well, thank you. I'm honored. I actually, as we were discussing before I started this interview, I was listening to one of Melissa's mindfulness podcasts where she took listeners on guided visualization. I strongly recommend it. It's her December 9th podcast of 2022. So if you guys want to go on a wonderful guided visualization mindfulness exercise, check it out.
Thank you so much, Kitt. And just for the listeners, I did not pay Kitt to say that. So that was very nice of her to do. I was not expecting that. So that's very kind, and love the support. And I do love putting together those mindfulness exercises because I don't know, like I need that reminder too. And by putting them on, I remember to engage in the very practice that I'm leading people through. So with that, let's get into you, Kitt. Let's talk a little bit about you. What listeners might be really interested in, just to actually get started off with, is your journey. Your journey, now you're an author and a mental health advocate. You do all sorts of amazing things in your everyday life. But how did you get there? That's what people always want to know. How did somebody get there? Did they just magically arrive at this exalted place where their purpose is completely fulfilled? And for the listeners who can't see her, Kitt is laughing and like almost falling over. So
Right.
with that, I guess my question is, where did this all begin for you?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is I have the benefit of age and hindsight,
Mm,
right? So that my journey began, I'm 59 now, and my journey began when I was 18. I mean, really, my journey began before that, but the crisis
sure.
happened when I was 18. And when I was 18, I was suicidal. And I thought that the world would be a better place without me. I thought my family would be better off without me. I had all of these of horrible self-loathing thoughts. And it's amazing how many people with depression have these thoughts.
Right.
And they were illogical. There was no reason for me to feel, there was no logical reason for me to feel this way. I did a lot of good things. I was a volunteer at the emergency room at UCLA. I was a good person, but these feelings were extremely painful. It basically was a living hell. And so I went from just having the ideas to actually having a plan and the means. And I knew from my volunteer work and my training, I knew that meant that I was at a risk of actually doing it. So all of a sudden, I basically dissociated from myself. I kind of took a step back and observed myself and observed what I was doing. And I said, oh my goodness, this isn't just thoughts now. I'm actually going to do this. I have a plan. I have a suicide note. I'm gathering up pills. And so I called a friend of mine and I asked her to come over and stay with me until I could get into a good psychologist at UCLA Medical Center. And I went to my resident assistant in the dorms and I said to her, please get me to see somebody really good today. So I had the strength to be able to observe what was going on and see what was going on and to ask for help and get the help that I needed.
How do you think that happened? We often hear that people don't have that sort of meta awareness of like, oh my gosh, this is what I'm doing and this is risky. What do you think contributed to your courage or strength to see that and then actually do something about it?
I think it was part of just, I'm going to say who I am.
Okay. Yeah.
I was always kind of a feisty fighter. So there was part of me that in spite of the depression was like, no way, I'm going to fight this thing.
Mhm.
Right. So there was part of me that always was kind of somebody who intellectualized stuff. So I already had that meta thing always going on where I was analyzing things that were going on. So I was able to, and I dissociated in a negative way. I used to pick actually throughout my life up until I was in my 40s, I picked my skin and I would dissociate and do it for like a couple of hours.
Mhm.
So that rather than doing something positive, like say meditating, I would destroy my skin. And I would imagine myself doing exactly what I'm doing right now, actually, which is just bizarre. I would imagine myself being interviewed or doing speaking,
Mm.
public speaking. What I was imagining was fine, but what I was doing was not fine. So that to me is interesting, like how do you then replace that destructive behavior with constructive behavior? But still, if what was going on in the mind was fine, that wasn't the destructive part. But because I had been dissociating, it I already had that ability to be
Mhm.
able to observe myself. This time I observed myself when I was destroying my skin. I actually didn't observe myself until the end where I was like, oh my God, what have I done?
Right, right. But
So
when you were 18 and having the suicidal ideation and planning, you were able to dissociate maybe in a positive way in the sense that you were able to have the awareness. And it sounds like you also had the knowledge
correct.
around what was happening. So that was key too, is understanding and having the knowledge of, oh, this means trouble.
Right, right. Because I had been trained, I had been, I was like a total pre-med nerd. So, I mean, I didn't end up becoming a doctor, but I was really into it. I wanted to be a neurosurgeon and I was volunteering at the emergency room. I was a total overachiever. And I was training to be a peer health counselor. And one of my specialties was stress, which was basically doing meditation. So, you know what I mean? So I had
Mhm.
these skills and knowledge from the training I was doing as a peer health counselor and the volunteer work I was doing and all my pre-med love and brain geeking out stuff to actually know that what I was doing was very dangerous. It wasn't just a thought. I was at high risk of actually hurting myself.
And I think that's such an important point too, that not only did you have the knowledge and the awareness, but that you had the knowledge and awareness, and that didn't stop you from having these feelings and these thoughts, right? Like
That's right.
we can have all of this incredible self-awareness, doesn't matter. This is still what is happening. So just think that's such an important point, that you can have all this self-knowledge and still suffer.
Correct.
Yeah.
That is correct. In fact, sometimes the self-knowledge can be counterproductive if you're just digging yourself in deeper and deeper. Like when I was 18, I did cognitive behavioral therapy, and that was actually very helpful for me. It can get boring after a time, but I learned the skill of how to like stop irrational thoughts. But when I was in my mid 20s, I went to grad school to become a psychotherapist, and I was trained to do psychodynamic psychotherapy. And the therapy I was in at that time, which was like analysis, was all about how I had been abused as a child. And that made me more and more and more depressed
Right,
because
because you could just dig
it
in
was just
and
digging.
look more and be there more in all of that pain and suffering.
Correct. So it didn't really, I mean, I did work through it, which is good. But in terms of my biological illnesses that I had, this, sort of intergenerational illness, it wasn't helping me. And finally, it got to the point when I was 30, where I had a year that was really tough. My grandma died. A friend from high school died of AIDS. It was the late 80s. I was a psychotherapist in San Francisco at that point, and I was among a lot of friends who were HIV positive, and it was just horrible. And then I switched from working with teenage girls who are severely emotionally disturbed, and it was very, very difficult work, to working with teenage boys. And a 16-year-old boy threatened to rape me during session. And that just brought me like, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
And I just couldn't even get out of bed. And I called my parents and I said, I can't get out of bed. I just can't do this anymore. And they said, why don't you try medication? You've been trying therapy since you were 18. Why don't you try? Well, they didn't know actually all my history because I didn't tell them all about it until later. When I was 30, I think I told them everything. So they said, why don't you try medication? And so I went to my doctor and got on an antidepressant, the first SSRI, which is Prozac. And then I had a side effect. And so she gave me a second antidepressant to sort of take an edge off the side effect. And my parents said, well, why don't you see a psychiatrist for a second opinion? So I went to see a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist took me off those and put me on a tricyclic, which is an old school antidepressant. And not that there's anything wrong with that class of antidepressant, but for me, it triggered full-blown mania. So I ramped up to 1 week of not being able to sleep and thinking in binary, that's zeros and ones. That's how computers think, on off, about chaos theory, which is physics and mathematics, and about the Christian mystic saints, which I was familiar with. I identify with them, actually. And so here I was having these streaming thoughts going through my mind, and they were going too fast for me able to comprehend them. And I was observing them because I found it fascinating as the intellect that I was. I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I said, gee, it's too bad I'm not able to record this to see if it makes any sense, to see if I put these zeros and ones in a computer, whether it makes sense or if the other thoughts make sense. So what happened was a friend of mine who knew what was going on with me called my priest and said, Kitt needs someone with her right now. She's not well. And she called my dad and she said, you have to fly up and be with Kitt. I can't help her. She needs help. And
do you have a sense at all that something was not right with you, or were you just experiencing the mania, as I've often heard from others, that, it kind of feels good?
Let's take a quick break.
Hey everybody, this is Melissa with The Fully Mindful. It's the new year, and I bet you're feeling the need to unlock your full potential and embrace empowerment, or maybe something completely different. Well, I'm excited to offer a new program with one-on-one breathwork and coaching sessions. We'll embark on a truly transformative journey of self-discovery, combining conscious, connected breathwork and embodiment coaching, and more. So contact me, Melissa, at The Fully Mindful, for your transformative session today.
Well, it's interesting. I knew I was psychotic and I knew I was manic, but I was fascinated by it. And so part of me, I knew it was mania, but I was fascinated by it.
Right. So you still had that meta-ness like you had
Yes.
when you were 18 and maybe again when you were in your mid 20s. And then here you are, you kind of have it again,
Mhm.
but it's intriguing. So
Right.
you're still kind of there, but your friend had a sense that this just isn't right.
Right. She knew I was manic. She knew I was sick, that I was psychotic. She knew that I was having an episode of some sort. So those people intervened. The priest came over, and the priest came with a seminarian who had bipolar disorder and had been hospitalized for it, because that was something that actually I felt like I had a calling for. And I've actually been to seminary since then. So they came over basically to both normalize and help me cope with it. Not normalize like it was normal, but you know what I mean? Help me cope with it. This was because he brought somebody who's experienced it. And they had me call my psychiatrist, and I explained what was going on to my psychiatrist. I said, no harm done, because I knew I was a psychotherapist. I knew that mania could be harmful, right? I said, I haven't done anything harmful. I've just moved into a cottage and took on renovating it, like painting it, which was not unusual for me to do.
So you call your psychotherapist, let them know what's going on. You've gotten support from this seminarian who's experienced this before. What do you do now? I mean, that medication was triggering this, it sounds like. So,
Right.
but you need something. So what do you do?
Right. Well, what was interesting was that psychiatrist kept me on the medication, but at a different dose, and tried to keep a closer eye on me. But my brain was basically broken, and I wasn't able to function, and I wasn't able to take care of myself. I kept on trying. My parents came and they stayed with me for a while, and I'd fall asleep driving. I wasn't able to read. So I tried to take a temp job, and I wasn't able to read. The letters in a word would fly apart. The words in a sentence would fly apart, because it's just, my brain it hadn't recovered from that episode. And so I ended up deciding to move back in with my parents until I was better. The psychiatrist poo-pooed it. He explained to me that I was in the adolescent stage of development, which was very insulting, because here I was, a master's level psychotherapist. I had gone to grad school on my own. I was licensed. That's not an easy thing to live on your own in the San Francisco Bay Area, to go to grad school. So I was pretty offended by that, because it was really a biological thing that was happening to me.
And I think that's important, right? You had no more control over what was happening with your brain than somebody has if they have a heart condition and it's genetic, let's say. It's just something that's happening and you don't have control over it. So to say that you were at the adolescent stage is very much like saying you have some sort of control over it. You're choosing to be right here instead of further along.
Right, right. But it was the training. It was the psychodynamic way of looking at it. It was sort of there was a sort of thing about Winnicott's Good Enough Mother, where he would take a patient and regress them, and then they would kind of rebuild. But this wasn't a psychological regression. This was like a biochemical reaction. So I actually ended up moving back in with my parents for a short period of time. The psychiatrist scoffed, but they were so supportive of me. And here I had worked with extremely dysfunctional families as a psychotherapist. And so my just ordinary alcoholic Irish family was just,
I love that it's like the ordinary alcoholic family.
It was the ordinary alcoholic family. And I remember around that time I was watching movies where it was lighthearted in terms of having that sort of intergenerational alcoholic, or the alcoholic uncle or whatever in Saturday Night Live, or all that kind of stuff. It's like, yes, we all have alcoholics in our lives. It doesn't mean that we live as victims of those alcoholics, even if behavior was bad, and and may have, when we were younger, victimized us. And I did, my mother's passed away. I did have to protect myself from behavior because of alcohol, but that wasn't all that I was. I was strong. So I moved back in with my parents. They went beyond the call of duty to help me out. They got me a good psychiatrist. I saw a psychiatrist and psychotherapist while I was living with them. I got on a different medication. They did not diagnose me bipolar because they thought that episode was triggered by antidepressants, and that I was just very sensitive to antidepressants, because they looked at my preceding behavior, and they said, there's nothing in your preceding behavior that fills the diagnostic criteria at that time for bipolar disorder, because I was functional.
Right. The good
supposedly.
old DSM. You have to fit all
Right.
these different criteria.
You have to fit,
before the
right.
line.
And this was before bipolar 2. Bipolar type 2 was in the DSM. I mean, I was full-blown manic and psychotic during that episode, but they thought it was just what they call iatrogenic, which meant it was caused by the meds, the antidepressants. So the psychiatrist said, has anybody ever talked to you about lithium? And I said, no, but if you think that I'm bipolar and should be on lithium, that's fine. I will go on lithium. I don't have a problem with that. And he said, no, let's give this a try. So he very slowly put me on a different SSRI, Zoloft. And whenever my thoughts would start to race, I would call him, and then he'd reduce the dose and titrate me more slowly. And I ended up being functional throughout my 30s on antidepressants, on low dose antidepressants, until I was 39. And at 39, I had a toddler son. So I was postpartum technically, which puts you in a different place in terms of your hormones. So I started to have euphoric feelings that God was calling me to one church for spiritual direction and to another church for Bible study. And although my behavior was fine, going to spiritual direction or Bible studies, fine, that feeling I recognized, that euphoria. And so I called the advice nurse on my insurance, and she said, go to the emergency room now or see a psychiatrist today. And so
rather urgent.
urgent. And I had my husband get on the phone because I wanted him to hear how serious this was, because you can't see what's going on inside someone's head. And if you're not schooled in it, you don't necessarily know how serious it is when somebody says, I feel euphoric.
Right. And you're trained and you had been licensed and practiced psychotherapy. So you were very familiar with, oh, this is euphoria. So it's not like some layperson saying like, well, I feel extra good. Like the fact that you were using that word had particular import.
Right. And the nurse, I was able to speak the same language as the nurse, and I was able to get my point across. And so it was a Friday. So I wasn't able to get in to see a psychiatrist. I didn't want to go to the emergency room because I knew that meant hospitalization, and I didn't want to be hospitalized. So I went to my regular doctor and agreed to see a psychiatrist on Monday. I made an appointment to see a psychiatrist on Monday. And I was diagnosed bipolar type 2 at that point. And later that diagnosis was changed to type 1 when I was hospitalized, and I was voluntarily hospitalized. And that was when I was 39. I was diagnosed bipolar when my son was 2 and still breastfeeding. So I was still considered postpartum because I was still breastfeeding, but I had to wean him because of the meds. The antidepressants were okay because he had low serum levels in the breast milk. Depakote, the seizure medication, not okay. So I have a sweet little story here. To wean him, because he had never been without his mama, I went to my parents' house over the weekend, and my son didn't believe that I wasn't coming home. So he insisted that he sit with my husband, with his dad, at the driveway. And then it started to rain a little bit. So my husband talked him into going underneath the eave, and then up to the front door, and then to the stairs, bottom of the stairs, up the stairs, finally in the master bedroom looking at the open door. And finally my son fell asleep. It's just so sweet.
Yeah. And what a wonderful way for your husband to walk him through in a way that was comfortable for him to get to that point where he felt comfortable enough to fall asleep. And it's so interesting. You talked about Depakote being an anti-seizure medicine. And we think talked about this, and I don't know if you've made it through the book Brain Energy by Dr. Palmer. I have not made it through, but
I have not
started.
made it through, but I started reading it. I did start reading it. Yeah.
And for the listeners, this book is phenomenal. Everyone should be listening to what Dr. Palmer has to say. And essentially, what he's found is that mental illness is really a metabolic disorder of the brain. And it's fascinating. And he takes people through the history of neurological disorders actually being related to, if not really the same thing as mental illness. And we've always kept them separately. Like you would go see a neurologist for one thing, but you'd see a psychiatrist or a psychologist for another disorder. But in fact, Depakote, an anti-seizure medicine, which is really a neurological medicine, is regularly prescribed as a medicine for a mental illness. And many of the medications that are typically given for anti-seizure, for epilepsy or other considered neurological conditions, are off-label and prescribed as for mental illness. And I think that's so fascinating. And so that's what he talks about, is this relationship. There's really not any difference. And I think I love that too, because I think it has a tendency to further destigmatize mental illness. Is like,
Yes.
this really is it's physical. So often I think there's this, and I'm sure you've experienced this, there's this profound misunderstanding among so many people that mental illness is something that you have a choice over, or that you have
Correct.
control over.
Right. Or
And
they just blame the mom.
right, or they blame the mom or the dad or whoever. And certainly there are factors that can exacerbate or make things worse, but it's not the cause. And so, sorry, I just went off on that tangent. I just was like, oh, that's right. We have to rethink mental illness. And I know that's your area, so we will get into that. But
Oh, I'm with you totally. I mean, it's interesting because I remember I blogged once about having a conversation with my dad when he had dementia. And he said, "How is what I have different than what you have?" And I said, "Dad, you're right.
Mhm.
They call your thing neurologic and mine mental illness, but really they're both the same."
Yeah. And they often have the same treatments.
Mm-hmm.
So I know Dr. Chris Palmer talks about how he believes that eventually these areas will merge because the science is just headed in that direction.
Right. Well, and he goes further in talking about it being a metabolic condition. One of the first treatments and one of the best treatments still for a lot of epilepsy and seizure disorders is a ketogenic diet, a
Right.
high fat diet, because the brain needs fat.
Well, and
And
it mimics starvation, right?
right.
Which is, so, and that's what they found, is that, in the early, I think it was 1900s, when they were looking at these conditions of epilepsy, is that when basically kids, I think they were mostly looking at, stopped eating, they were having fewer seizures. And so they're like, well, what can we do to sort of mimic? Obviously, you can't starve yourself to death. That wouldn't be good. Leads to death. So what do? Well, the ketogenic sort of mimics not starvation, but like this certain process that is evidently beneficial for people who have seizures. Right. And it has the same effect, evidently, with mental illness. Dr. Chris Palmer talks about many studies, but his own experience in his practice of actually even treating somebody with schizoaffective disorder, which is schizophrenia plus bipolar, if I've got that right. And so very serious. And for this particular patient, just treatment resistant. And evidently he wanted to lose weight too, thought that would help. And so went on a ketogenic diet. And lo and behold, not only did he lose weight, but some of his symptoms, his thinking, his highly paranoid thinking was gone. And that's just fascinating. It's
That's
fascinating.
amazing. Yeah.
So sorry, we digress.
Yeah. So I haven't gotten that far, but I do know, I am aware of the science around the, ketogenic diet or going into ketosis and, and having to feed your brain fat. You can't starve it from fat. So what kind of fat, though, is probably, I don't know. There's a lot of debate nowadays about vilifying fat.
Right. No, 100%. So
Hey, everybody, if you like this conversation and are looking to align your work and life with your purpose or uncover your purpose in the first place, work with me. I coach people ready to uncover and appreciate their worth, make an impact, and find meaning and purpose in the work they do, whether that's personal or professional work. Get your mind right and make your plan for impact and coach with me. Connect with me for 15 or 20 at the Calendly link in the show notes below and talk about coaching with me.
let's go back to your story.
Okay.
You're back when you're like 39 or so, and you have this young son, and you're experiencing this euphoria, and you recognize this. You make an agreement with your doctor to see a psychiatrist on Monday. What happened after that?
Well, what's interesting, because of my internalized self-stigma, because of my knowledge of having been a psychotherapist and seeing a difference, thinking of depression as a non-serious mental illness and bipolar as a serious progressive mental illness, I thought, even though my diagnosis changed, I was the same person. I immediately put my son in daycare and went back to work, because I thought that he was not safe in my care. I thought he'd be safer in somebody else's care than my care. And so I tried then for the next couple of years to work and take care of him and take care of myself, and I wasn't able to. And I had a very challenging job as an investment analyst for an entrepreneur. And sometimes we were there until 2 a.m. in the morning at work. It was just very, it was a very demanding job. And so I got to the point where one day at work, I just broke into tears when I went out on an errand and came back to bring something, and I couldn't bring myself to go up to the office, and I couldn't stop crying, and I would just kept on breaking down into crying jags. And the psychologist I was seeing at the time said, okay, let's take a week off work and see how you're doing. And I wasn't able to even make it through the weekend. I said, no, I know I need to be hospitalized. I just know it. And I had what was called a mixed episode and rapid cycling. And those are both very dangerous things. They put you at high risk of self-harm and suicide, because you have the energy to do something bad, because sometimes when you're extremely depressed, you're so depressed you can't even get the energy to do something. But when you have the mix of being both manic and depressed, or rapidly cycling between the two, that puts you at extremely high risk. So I had myself voluntarily hospitalized. It actually was a wonderful experience. I did not have a traumatic experience. I went to a hospital in Laguna Beach where they had group programs scheduled all day, right? So you'd be in art therapy and occupational therapy and yoga, the whole day. And then after 2 weeks of that in the hospital, I was in for a few months. I did their partial hospitalization, which is what you might consider day treatment. It's like your 9-to-5 job. You go to the hospital for outpatient group therapy from 9 to 5, and then you go back home. And so after a few months, I got bored. I stopped doing it. I did not go back to work. I actually got on disability, but I went to seminary the fall following that, just a couple of months after that, because my psychologist was like, okay, so tell me a little bit more about this feeling you've had since you were 22 that you have a calling. And I had always been ambivalent about it because I knew I had this history since I was 18 of mental illness. And so I didn't know if this feeling of call was a symptom of mental illness or whether it was valid. And I also wasn't churched. I mean, there were times in my life since then that I'd been to church, but I did not grow up churched.
And so, I mean, I can see that too. This like, is this for real? Or is this something that, is, like you said, a symptom of the mental illness that I have? And that's terrible, right? Like, not to know the difference. And I think so many of us, whether we have a mental illness diagnosis or not, have been in that situation. Is this for real, or is this just something that I'm thinking of? that I
Right.
just sort of made up in my head. And
Right.
so it's so brave of you to have decided to talk about that with a psychologist, explore it, and then decide, I think maybe this is real.
Right. Right. I had the benefit of that particular psychologist grew up with nuns.
Mm,
So she kind of understood that whole idea of calling, because obviously nuns, that's a big choice to make. So I ended up going to a seminary. And when I went to the seminary, it became clear in the papers I was writing and the work I was doing in seminary that I had a mental health history, that I was being called to a mental health ministry. And I didn't complete seminary. We moved. And then later I reapplied to the same seminary, was readmitted. And then my husband lost his job and they even called up and they're like, is there anything we could do, financial aid or anything? And I said, it's just when something like that happens, when we move or when my husband loses his job, it just affects me so deeply that I'm not really able to go to seminary. I'm not really able to function at that level. I've got to kind of a cocooning, to sort of get to basics because it's so stressful.
yeah.
But that was very validating that the seminary that I had attended 2 different times reached out to me to see what they could do to keep me enrolled.
Right.
And it
Right.
was a Fuller Theological Seminary, which is a reputable denominational seminary. It's actually got a lot of, not everybody there is conservative, and I'm definitely not. I'm like way liberal. But in terms of my idea theologically, I was raised by, my parents left the Catholic Church when I was 5, and they raised me. I mean, I lived in Saudi Arabia for 5 years as a kid. So my parents raised me that all religions are about love. They might not always practice it because humans don't always practice what they preach.
Right.
But that basically all religions are about love. And my education was a Time Life book on world religions where my dad, would put me. My dad was a seminarian actually in high school, until he decided, no, I want to get married and have children, so I'm not going to continue becoming a priest. They started them young in Chicago back in the day.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They wanted you to take that route, then that's the
Like,
route that you took.
right.
Yeah.
Eldest son, you become the priest, you take care of the family. This is, you stay in Chicago. And he didn't do any of those things.
Yeah. But you still had the benefit of, whatever he had learned there and then decided to pass on to you this idea of all religions are based on love.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And my mom believed that too. And actually, my mom was really big into, when she was a 35-year non-Hodgkin's lymphoma survivor. And when she was doing her cancer treatment, she was part of Cedar Sinai's Wellness Center for Cancer. And they did a lot of mindfulness stuff like hypnotherapy and meditation. And she told me that she thought she was really good at meditation because she had always growing up, done all those rosary prayers. And it was the same mindset. And so that
Yeah, just like having a mantra, a rosary prayer
exactly,
is like having a mantra practice. Yeah.
exactly. So it was always a huge believer. She would visualize her T cells fighting the cancer cells and all that kind of stuff. So she was a huge advocate for meditation.
That's fantastic. So while you weren't able to finish your seminary, you went there for a long time, long enough to achieve all of this knowledge and probably most importantly, this mental health ministry idea. And so what did you do with that?
Well, I didn't do it right away, which is interesting. And I remember struggling with that some. And that same psychologist said, well, maybe what you're doing right now, maybe you can reframe it as a sabbatical. It was very hard for me not to, as a high achiever, not to work, not to have a purpose, or not to see, because I didn't really see being a mom as a purpose. I don't know why, but it turned out that my son was very high needs. He had anxiety, depression, really horrible migraines,
Mm.
and ADHD.
Mhm.
And so he was a very challenging kid to parent, and all of the skills I had. I mean, I had him in therapy at 4, and I had him seeing a psychiatrist at 5.
Right.
So he basically was my job up until, I don't know, up until he went to college.
Well, yeah. I mean, high needs or not, being a parent is a huge purpose.
Yeah, right.
And we
But it's
often forget to, and culture sort of
I know.
doesn't let us really believe that, even when it says that, oh, we value parents, that message isn't really supported by a lot of action.
Right, right. It's tough in our culture. It's tough. And also it was just tough for me because I'm going to put out there, parenting is not intellectually satisfying.
That is true. Yeah.
Emotionally demanding,
Yeah.
but it's more of something where you give, and I don't know how much you get back until late. Like now, it's fabulous. My son's doing great. He thanks me all the time. He also feels comfortable to say things that I did that hurt, and so I'm able to apologize because we make mistakes.
Sure.
And I always believe in owning up to your mistakes. Sorry for making you give that toy to charity as a discipline,
But mistakes are how we learn, right? If we
Right.
don't make mistakes, we generally don't learn. So it's amazing that you have that relationship now. And obviously, the actions you took while you were raising him when he was younger supported that.
Right. I always was just very open. I would apologize if I made a mistake.
Yeah. So, okay, let's fast forward a little bit to, we were talking about how you finished the seminary and you didn't do something right away.
Right. So what happened was I did the parenting, and then what happened was my husband's father went into sepsis. And my husband had to go, and all his siblings went to go and rally around him because it was this touch and go whether he was going to die. And this crisis precipitated a hypomanic episode in me, just because I was so worried. And all of a sudden, it also made me realize that we were in this time in our lives now where we were in between these two generations where our parents were, I realized, oh my gosh, my parents now might die, that we were at that point in time in our lives. And so to deal with the hypomania, I started blogging. And so the blogging turned into the mental health advocacy online, and the blog turned into my book.
Right. So, and the name of your book is?
The name of my book is Balancing Act: Writing Through a Bipolar Life. My blog, I haven't written since September, but I have a website, kittomalley.com, that has both great resources as well as links to all my social media places. And it has lots of stuff that I've written.
Yeah. And so you have this book and you have this online blogging that you're doing where you're talking about mental health issues and your own lived experience as well as the issues that you see. And what happens from that? Do you connect with other people? Like, what blossoms from that?
Well, early on, I was very involved in the mental health blogging community. And since I wrote my book and the pandemic happened and my parents died, I've sort of pulled back from that. I still am active, very active online. I share a lot of stuff, but I'm not as much doing a lot of writing since I wrote my book. I guess it's sort of like, that's like, okay, I wrote it. Well, now what's my new chapter?
Yeah.
My parents both at the end of their lives had dementia, and there was a lot that went into those last few years. And then my mom died right before the quarantine.
Wow.
And then COVID's changed all of our lives. And we moved up to Oregon. And what I'm doing now, actually, that I really love to do, actually, I forgot what I'm so enthusiastic about now, is that I'm volunteering for my local NAMI affiliate, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I volunteer for the Central Oregon affiliate for that. We're a small rural affiliate of NAMI, NAMI Oregon, and I love it.
Yeah. So, like, what do you do for them?
Well, I'm on their board. And I volunteer in terms of doing public speaking, if there's public speaking events. We're small and scrappy. So right now, what I'm mostly trying to do is recruit. So if any of you are in Central Oregon, in Deschutes, Crook, or Jefferson County, If you go to my web, if you go to me anywhere, any link of to me, I'll connect you. We really could use warm bodies because we're few and far between and the need is great.
So what kind of work will these new recruits do?
Okay. Well, we have two things that we offer. We have online support groups, and we're just rolling out an in-person family to family class, signature class. And so people can train for different things as they come up in terms of doing stuff. And what I'm doing a big push for is our Ending the Silence presentations for high schools, because our high schools and colleges, we're going to be doing some NAMI on campus work, probably starting next year, or Central Oregon Community College, because our adolescents are just in crisis, and there's been shootings and stuff like that. And it's just tragic.
And so it's ending the silence around mental illness.
Exactly.
De-stigmatizing mental illness so that people can get the help that they need and the support that they need and deserve to have.
That's right. So it's outreach to the high school so that they can connect. So I've done one of those presentations so far. I just got trained and I did one presentation before the new year.
That's fantastic. And I mean, I think it's so important. You and I talked before doing this podcast, and I had recently done, I'm a lawyer by day, and had done a presentation on substance use disorder and mental illness and destigmatizing that, because it was identified by the American Bar Association, the stigmatization of these things, as being one of the highest reasons why people don't get help, and they wait until their life is a disaster or worse and never get help. And that so many people suffer the consequences, not just the people with the SUDs and mental health disorders. I hate the word disorder. I really do. I'm just going to go on a tangent here and say,
Right.
I really want
mental health condition.
Yes. It's just
I've been trying to use that. I've been trying to like rewrite stuff that I had and put in condition, mental health condition, and take out illness and just mental health condition, because we don't, I mean, personally, I'm okay with using whatever word, but I think when you write it, just so that, because language takes different meanings over time. And
yeah, and I think it helps with this whole idea of destigmatizing this.
Exactly.
Because it's not a disorder. It's just something that's happening. It's an occurrence. It's something that is existing right now. And so many incredible things can come from it. In addition to, yes, there's suffering for sure. No question. But
well, that's
amazing things can come out of this.
Yes, that's the other. I mean, I don't want to romanticize mental health conditions, but there's a huge documented, a lot of research in terms of mood disorders coexisting with writing. There's historically been a lot of writers with mood disorders. When you have these intense feelings, you've got to do something with it. Like when I told you I had that crisis of intense feelings about my father-in-law, I had to put that somewhere. And so I put it into words. And I think that lawyers you're writing. That's what you do for a living, really.
Yeah, writing or in my case, talking all the time. And so, where my condition, which is, well, one of them is ADHD, and that has been really helpful because I like to talk with people. I like connecting with people. And the other benefit from having ADHD, I now see, I didn't see for a very, very long time, is this ability to see connections where others fail to see connections. And that was always a problem for me. Like, if you're trying to make something into chronological order or some sort of hierarchical order, very challenging. When you see they're all connected, you have no idea what's more important than something else, because they're all important, right? And so, or where do I put the Roman numeral, here, or does this go under the letter A? None of that makes sense. But I see these connections, and that's actually been really beneficial in my work as a lawyer, my work as a mindfulness teacher, my work as a coach, is that I see connections. It also can be really challenging, depending on what I'm doing. So I think that's what you're talking about, is like, right, there can be these benefits. And so it's important to see that there are these benefits that are really can be amazing. It doesn't take away from the difficulties and challenges and sometimes even suffering, depending on the condition, right?
Totally. I agree with you totally. And the same is true with both bipolar and the ADHD and others. I make the connections too. And I remember once in college, somebody saying, "How did you do that?" I'm like, "I don't know." I would always find layers of meaning when you'd be
Yeah, it just
analyzing
seemed
some
obvious
literature.
to me, you know, I
It's just
don't
like,
know.
yeah, how
Yeah,
could you not see the millions of layers of
right.
analogies?
Right. And I was identifying with what you're saying about writers. When I was in college, I was an English lit major and got my degree in English literature. And so I I wrote a lot of poetry and deep, heavy stuff. And it was not bad, it was pretty good. I mean, it's not like I published or anything, but I think that depression allowed me to feel things in a way that other people don't necessarily feel. But then when you write them, they connect with it,
Mm-hmm,
right? And
mm-hmm.
they appreciate it. So I do think that's really important. And I think that's part of what sort of, like you said, this ending the silence. Let's talk about this. And also let's recognize how ridiculously common it is for
Correct.
us. I think I was reading, it might have been in Chris Palmer's book, that something like 40% of Americans reported a mental health condition during the pandemic. 40%.
I know.
40%. And, pre-pandemic, it was still very high. It was,
Right.
I think, 20%. So, I mean, it is very, very common. And I don't think we're out of this with the pandemic. I mean, I think we're just beginning to fully appreciate as a society how much it impacted our mental health.
Oh my gosh. And can you think of how much it would impact a child's brain? That's going to have long-term consequences. I mean, luckily they're resilient. We do have neuroplasticity. I don't want to make it all negative, but still, that isolation and that lack of stimulation that we need to grow,
Yeah, I
you
mean,
know.
we're social beings, and
Mhm.
kids, that's how they're learning. And I think of my she was a preteen at the beginning of the pandemic, and then a teen.
Oh,
And I just think of all the things that were supposed to happen developmentally during that time that didn't get to happen for her and all of her peers. And then the kids who were younger, and then the kids who were in high school, and just the different struggles that undoubtedly they're going to have. Like you said, they're resilient. So that's fantastic. There's so much resilience, neuroplasticity, but we can't ignore what happened.
right.
That won't help.
No, without a doubt. Right. And I can't imagine how much the teachers are struggling, you know.
So one thing I'm interested in, and in these last few moments here, not to take away from the importance of this topic, but since you went to seminary and you felt called, and one of the things that we're sort of talking about more in the podcast this season, this year, is how our own spirituality, whatever form that may be in, whether that's a religion or, hybrid religion or a spiritual practice or whatever it is, how does that factor into your everyday life and or your purpose?
Honestly, I just believe that I have a passion for mental health. And I believe that's my purpose. I believe I'm living a purposeful life and I feel satisfied. I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. And everything that I've been through has brought me here. And it might not have been easy going through it. I didn't see it then, but I can see it now. Everything, it makes sense now at this time in my life. I think an important part of it is that we take our experiences and we make it meaningful. So that has to do with the reframing, so that rather than just feeling that life is just happening to us, that we go, okay, how can I take this and make it meaningful and purposeful, so that we're not just victims of our lives, but we actually, yes, we cannot control everything in our lives, but what we can control, just like the serenity prayer, right? I can take even the things I can't control. What I can control is how I respond to it and how I take meaning from it and
Right.
how I make it purposeful in
Right.
my life.
I love that. Yeah. It's what we do with what happens. And we
Exactly.
might not have control over everything that happens. In fact, there's very little we have control over, but we do have some choice, some agency in how we respond to that, and what we
Yes.
take away, and what we learn, and how we make meaning and purpose out of all these things that have happened. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I love that. Well, probably is a really good place to end on this.
That sounds great. I like it.
So I will put in the show notes all the places that you can be found. But for the listeners who might not check out the show notes, although you really, really should, where can we find you?
I can be found at KITTOMALLEY.com. Just put Kitt O'Malley in Google or any search engine and you'll find me. I'm all over social media. You'll find me. You can
Yes,
spell my name wrong and you'll still
find me. Google is really smart. That's amazing how that happens. And I know your book is on Amazon, both in the Kindle version as well as the paperback version. And you do have your blog, which I know you said you didn't post in September, but you probably will get back to. And you're doing all this amazing work with NAMI Oregon, the Central Oregon chapter, and would encourage anyone who's interested in that, whether it's in the Oregon chapter or their own state, wherever that may be. If you have, and you'll know it, a little bit of a calling for mental health, that's the place to be. It's really needed right now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kitt. And I can't wait to have you back and see how your recruitment efforts go.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
All right. Thank you so much.
Hey, everybody, if you like this conversation, make sure to rate the show in Apple or Spotify or wherever you are listening so that others can find it and enjoy it too. And if you like the show and want to keep hearing great conversations with really interesting people about how they found their purpose, please donate to the show. Go to thefullymindful.com to donate today. Hey everybody, it's Melissa, and I'm wondering if you all can relate. Have you ever caught yourself procrastinating or maybe doubting your abilities, or maybe you have a black belt inner critic like I do or have had that wants to sabotage your every move with judgment and perfectionism expectations? It might keep you stuck, it might keep you anxious and away from your full potential. The Positive Intelligence Program, PQ, is a powerful 6-week journey designed to help you quiet those saboteurs, embrace positivity, and find flow in your life. Through daily practices and weekly focuses, we'll work together to build your mental fitness. The PQ app will guide you every step of the way and support you, and you'll be supported either by myself in a one-on-one or in a small group of like-minded individuals where you can share insights and progress. So reach out, contact me at info@thefullymindful.com to find out how we can work together one-on-one or in a small group today.